The fog clung to the moors like a shroud, thick and unyielding, as Eliza trudged behind her sisters toward the crumbling estate. It was 1842, and the wind carried the salt of the distant sea, mingling with the peat smoke from their lantern. At 17, Eliza was the eldest, her dark hair pinned back severely, her boots caked in mud from the endless trek from York. She gripped the handle of their shared valise tighter, feeling the weight of the linens inside press against her palm. Beside her, Clara, 15 and sharp-eyed, hummed a tuneless melody to ward off the chill, while little Beatrice, barely 12, clutched Clara's skirt, her face pale as the mist itself. The Ashen Hall loomed ahead, its towers jagged against the slate-gray sky, windows like empty sockets staring out from ivy-choked stone. Their uncle's letter had promised refuge after their parents' fever claimed them months ago, a place to rebuild, away from the city's prying eyes. But as they approached the rusted iron gates, Eliza's stomach twisted. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no dog barked a welcome. Only the ravens circled overhead, their cries sharp as broken glass. "Uncle must be inside," Clara said, her voice steady despite the quiver in her fingers as she pushed the gate open. It screeched on hinges long neglected, and Beatrice flinched, pressing closer. Eliza nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. Their father had spoken of Uncle Reginald as a man of means, a collector of oddities from his travels. Yet the path to the door was overgrown, weeds thrusting up through cracked flagstones like insistent fingers. The heavy oak door yielded to Eliza's knock with a groan, swinging inward on its own. Dust motes danced in a sliver of light, and the air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something metallic, like old blood. "Hello?" Eliza called, her voice echoing down the shadowed corridor. No answer came, only the faint drip of water somewhere deep within the walls. They stepped inside, the door thudding shut behind them with a finality that made Beatrice whimper. Lantern in hand, Eliza led the way into the foyer, where a grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister carved with twisting vines that seemed to writhe in the flickering glow. Portraits lined the walls, stern faces in faded oils, eyes following their every move. Clara paused before one, tilting her head. "Look at her. She has our chin." Eliza glanced over, seeing the resemblance, high cheekbones, a mouth set in quiet defiance. But the woman's eyes were hollow, painted with shadows that bled into the canvas. "Come," she urged, pulling Beatrice along. They needed a fire, beds, something to shake the chill that had settled into their bones. The parlor was their first sanctuary, a room of sagging velvet chairs and a hearth cold as the grave. Clara set about striking flint to tinder while Eliza explored, her fingers trailing over a sideboard cluttered with brass instruments, compasses, astrolabes, vials of clouded glass. One caught her eye, a slender syringe, its needle glinting wickedly. She recoiled, heart pounding, as Beatrice tugged her sleeve. "Sister, what's that noise?" Beatrice whispered, her wide eyes fixed on the ceiling. A soft scratching, like nails on wood, emanated from above. Eliza froze, listening. It paused, then resumed, rhythmic, insistent. "Rats," she said firmly, though her pulse raced. "Uncle's been away too long. We'll find him tomorrow." They supped on bread and cheese from their packs, the meager meal turning to ash in their mouths under the room's oppressive silence. As night deepened, the scratching grew louder, migrating to the walls, as if something paced just beyond sight. Clara's face drained of color, but she forced a smile for Beatrice. "It's the house settling, like Father said homes do after rain." Eliza nodded, though she knew better. Rain hadn't fallen in days. When they finally sought the bedrooms upstairs, the halls twisted like a labyrinth, doors creaking open to reveal chambers shrouded in dust sheets. The first room they claimed had a four-poster bed, its canopy moth-eaten, linens yellowed but intact. Beatrice climbed in first, burrowing under the covers with a sigh. "Soft," she murmured, eyelids drooping. Eliza and Clara shared the next bed, the mattress sagging under their weight. Exhaustion pulled at them, but sleep evaded Eliza. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a deeper quiet, the kind that amplified every creak of the house. She lay still, listening to her sister's breathing even out, the lantern's flame guttering low. It began as a prickle on her skin, faint at first, like the brush of spider silk. Then warmth bloomed beneath her, seeping through her night shift. She shifted, frowning, and felt it, wetness, sticky and spreading. Panic surged as she sat up, the sheets clinging damply to her thighs. In the dim light, she saw the stain, dark crimson, blooming like ink on parchment. "Eliza?" Clara stirred, voice thick with sleep. But Eliza was already pulling back the covers, her breath catching at the sight. Not just on her, Beatrice thrashed in her bed, a thin cry escaping her lips as blood welled from her arms, her legs, wherever the fabric touched. The linens were alive with it, soaking through as if the bed itself drew the life from them. Clara screamed then, leaping up, her own hands smeared red where they'd rested on the pillow. They scrambled out, barefoot on the cold floor, hearts hammering in the sudden horror of the room. The blood didn't pool on the wood, it vanished into the sheets, leaving only the metallic tang in the air. "What devilry is this?" Clara gasped, clutching Beatrice to her chest as the girl sobbed, pale and trembling. Eliza stared at the bed, its innocent canopy now a veil over nightmare. The house had welcomed them, but not to rest. Something in these walls hungered, and it had tasted them first. The fog clung to the cobblestones like a shroud as Eliza pushed open the creaking door of the apothecary's shop. Her fingers, pale and trembling from the chill, left faint smudges on the brass handle. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and something sharper, laudanum, perhaps, or the metallic tang of blood that seemed to follow her everywhere. Clara trailed behind, her footsteps soft but deliberate, the hem of her gray woolen dress brushing against the threshold. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, looked up from his ledger. His eyes narrowed, taking in their identical pallor, the way they both avoided the light filtering through the grimy window. "Sisters Ashford, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't rise, but his hand rested on the counter, fingers drumming a slow rhythm. Eliza noted the mortar and pestle nearby, stained with residues she didn't want to identify. "We need more of the tonic," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. She placed a few coins on the scarred wooden surface, earnings from the seamstress work she took in secret, under the cover of dusk. Clara hovered close, her breath shallow, eyes darting to the shelves lined with jars of murky liquids and bundled roots. The older sister always did this, scanning for threats, her caution a shield against the world's prying gaze. The apothecary pushed his spectacles up and stood, moving to a locked cabinet at the back. The usual mix. Willow bark, iron supplements, and that special salve for the irritation. He glanced at them sidelong, as if testing the waters. Eliza nodded curtly, ignoring the implication. Beds made them bleed, raw, weeping sores that no liniment could fully heal, forcing them into the cold embrace of pine boxes lined with straw. It had started years ago, after their parents' fever took them, leaving the sisters to fend in this forsaken mill town on the Thames edge. Doctors called it a curse of the blood, the villagers whispered of something darker. As he measured out the powders, a shadow fell across the doorway. Mr. Hargrove, the mill foreman, stepped in, his boots thudding heavily. Broad-shouldered and red-faced from the damp, he carried the air of authority that came from owning half the looms in Ashford Mills. "Morning, Mr. Poole," he grunted, then froze at the sight of the girls. His gaze lingered on Clara, who shrank back instinctively, her hand finding Eliza's sleeve. "Foreman," Poole acknowledged, sliding the vial across to Eliza. She snatched it up, tucking it into her basket. Hargrove's lips curled into a thin smile. "Out early, are we? Thought you lot preferred the night." His words hung heavy, laced with the town's undercurrent of suspicion. The sisters had been marked since childhood, their skin like porcelain, never tanning under the sun, and the rumors of coffins in their attic, glimpsed by a nosy stable boy. Eliza met his stare, her bravery a quiet fire. Some errands can't wait for darkness, sir. Clara tugged at her arm, a silent plea to leave. But Hargrove blocked the way, leaning against the doorframe. Heard about the incident at the parsonage last week. Old Widow Green swears she saw shapes in the graveyard, pale as ghosts, disturbing the graves. He paused, eyes flicking between them. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? The air in the shop grew stifling. Eliza's pulse quickened, a rare heat rising in her veins. They hadn't gone near the graveyard, not since the night they dragged the empty coffin from the undertaker's discard pile, paying with scavenged silver. It was their sanctuary, hidden in the rafters of the abandoned weaver's loft they called home. But whispers spread like mildew in the fog-shrouded alleys. Poole cleared his throat, busying himself with a stack of tins. Just buying remedies, Hargrove. Leave the girls be. Hargrove chuckled, a sound like grinding gears. Remedies for what ails them? Or for what they bring on others? He straightened, stepping aside but not before brushing too close to Clara, who flinched as if burned. The door swung shut behind them with a finality that echoed in Eliza's ears. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the spire of the church in the distance. Clara's breath came in quick gasps. He knows something, Eliza. We should go back, seal the loft tighter. Eliza gripped the basket handle until her knuckles whitened. He suspects, but he has no proof. We stick to the plan, work the nights, avoid the lights. Yet as they hurried down the lane, past the skeletal frames of idle looms shrouded in mist, a prickle ran up her spine. Hargrove's words lingered, a seed of dread taking root. The tonic would ease the bleeding for another week, but the real wound was the town's growing eyes, watching, waiting for a slip. By midday, they reached the edge of the mills, where the river churned black under the overcast sky. Clara paused at the water's edge, dipping a hand in to wash away the shop's clinging scent. The current pulled at her fingers, cold and insistent. What if it's not just beds? What if it's us? Her voice was a whisper, laced with the fear she rarely voiced. Eliza knelt beside her, watching the ripples distort their reflections, two faces, sharp and ethereal, like figures from a faded daguerreotype. Then we adapt, like always. Coffins or rivers, we'll find our rest. But even as she said it, the fog seemed to press closer, carrying faint echoes from the town, footsteps, murmurs, the distant toll of a bell marking the hour. The challenge wasn't just the blood, it was the isolation closing in, thread by thread, like a noose woven from suspicion. Eliza's fingers trembled as she traced the splintered edge of the coffin lid, the wood cool and unyielding under her touch. Moonlight slanted through the attic window, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the dusty floorboards. Below, the house creaked in the night wind, a low groan that mimicked the labored breaths of the dying. Beatrice lay still in her own box, her chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm, but Eliza couldn't shake the image from earlier that evening, the fresh blood seeping through the linen sheets they'd tried, just once, in desperation. She'd woken to it first, the sticky warmth pooling beneath her, staining her nightgown crimson. Beatrice had stirred moments later, her cry muffled against the pillow, a sound like a wounded animal. They'd stripped the bed in silence, the metallic tang hanging heavy in the air, and dragged the coffins up from the cellar without a word. But now, with the town doctor's visit looming at dawn, Eliza wondered if hiding their affliction would buy them time or doom them faster. The stairs whispered under her bare feet as she descended, avoiding the third step that always squeaked. In the kitchen, the fire had died to embers, and she poked at it absently, watching sparks flare and fade. Their supplies were dwindling, the last jar of preserved plums sat half-empty on the shelf, and the well water had turned brackish from the summer drought. If the doctor came sniffing around, as father had warned in his final letter, he'd see more than their pallor. He'd see the coffins, or the blood-stained rags they'd buried in the garden. A soft thud echoed from the parlor. Eliza froze, her poker clattering to the floor. "Beatrice," she called, voice barely above a hush. No answer. She crept toward the door, heart thudding against her ribs, the air growing thicker with each step. The room was dim, lit only by the sliver of moon through the curtains, but there, on the threadbare rug, lay Beatrice's shawl, discarded like a shed skin. Eliza's breath caught as she knelt, fingers brushing the fabric. It was damp, not from sweat, but something darker. A trail of droplets led to the window, where the latch hung loose, swaying in the breeze. The glass was smudged with handprints, small and frantic, as if Beatrice had pressed against it in terror. Outside, the garden stretched black and tangled, the apple tree's branches clawing at the sky like desperate fingers. She slipped through the door, the night air biting her skin, raising gooseflesh despite the lingering summer heat. The grass was slick underfoot, and she followed the trail, her pulse a wild drum in her ears. B. The name dissolved into the rustle of leaves. At the edge of the yard, where the fence met the woods, she found her sister, huddled against the post, knees drawn to her chest, face buried in her arms. Beatrice looked up, eyes wide and glassy, her lips parted as if to scream but no sound came. "It followed me," she whispered, voice cracking like dry twigs. "From the attic. I saw it in the shadows, eyes, Eliza, glowing like coals." Eliza dropped beside her, pulling Beatrice close, feeling the tremor in her sister's frame. The woods loomed behind them, a wall of darkness where the trees pressed together, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes. She dismissed Beatrice's mutterings earlier as fevered dreams, blame it on the heat or the hunger gnawing at them both. But now, with the air humming with unseen movement, doubt crept in like fog. "What did it look like?" Eliza asked, scanning the tree line. A branch snapped, sharp and close, and both girls flinched. "Not like a man. Taller, thinner. It whispered my name through the cracks in the floor." Beatrice's hand clutched Eliza's sleeve, nails digging in. "It knows about the beds. About why we bleed." Eliza swallowed hard, the words sticking in her throat. Their curse, or whatever it was, had started after Mother's death 2 years past, when the family estate crumbled and they were left to fend alone. Normal beds blistered their skin, turned rest into agony, forcing them into these makeshift graves. The town whispered of consumption or worse, but no one came close enough to see the truth. Until now. "We can't stay out here," Eliza said, hauling Beatrice to her feet. Her sister's weight sagged against her, light as a ghost. They stumbled back toward the house, the trail of damp earth marking their path. Inside, Eliza barred the door, the heavy oak thudding into place, but the whispers seemed to seep through the walls, faint and insistent. Beatrice collapsed onto the parlor settee, curling into herself. "The doctor's coming because of the letters. Someone saw us dragging the boxes. What if he brings men? What if they take us away?" Eliza paced, mind racing. The plan had been simple: feign illness, keep to the shadows, wait out the drought until they could slip away to the city. But if something lurked in the woods, drawn by their blood or their strangeness, waiting might not be an option. She glanced at the mantel, where Father's old revolver sat, unloaded and gathering dust. Useless against shadows, perhaps, but it was something. As dawn's first light grayed the horizon, a knock echoed through the house, too early, too insistent. Eliza's blood ran cold. Not the doctor. Something else, testing the door. The fog clung to the cobblestones like a shroud as Eliza led the way through the narrow alley behind the apothecary. Her boots splashed in shallow puddles, each step echoing too loudly in the pre-dawn hush. Beatrice trailed close, her breath coming in shallow bursts, one hand clutching the rough wool of her shawl as if it could ward off the chill seeping from the stones. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, rot, perhaps, from the river that wound through Eldridge Hollow. They had slipped out of the coffin-maker's workshop just after midnight, the weight of their secret cargo slung over Eliza's shoulder in a burlap sack. Inside rattled the vials of tincture Mr. Harrow had pressed into their hands, his eyes darting like a cornered fox. "This'll ease the burning, girls," he'd whispered, "but mind the dose. Too much, and it'll stop your heart cold." Eliza's fingers tightened on the sack strap. She was the bold one, always had been, with her sharp jaw and quicker tongue, but tonight even her resolve felt frayed at the edges. Beatrice stumbled on a loose brick, catching herself against the wall. Her skin, pale as moonlight even in the gloom, bore faint red welts from the previous night's failed rest, a thin mattress in the attic that had wept blood from her pores after only an hour. "Eliza, slow down," she murmured, her voice a thread of caution woven through the mist. "What if Father's men are already watching the bridges?" Eliza glanced back, her dark eyes flashing with that familiar fire. "They won't be. Not yet. Father's too busy with his sermons to notice us gone till the church bells ring." But doubt gnawed at her words. Reverend Ashford, their father, had grown suspicious these past weeks, his Bible-thumping lectures laced with questions about their delicate constitutions. The sisters' affliction was no mere illness, it was a curse, whispered to stem from their mother's grave, where she'd been buried with a locket of forbidden herbs. Beds of feather or straw turned their nights to agony, skin splitting like overripe fruit, forcing them to the cold sanctuary of pine boxes lined with oilcloth. The alley opened onto the riverbank, where willows drooped like weary sentinels. Eliza knelt by the water's edge, pulling a small boat from its hiding spot among the reeds. The wood was slick with dew, and as she steadied it, a ripple disturbed the surface, not a fish, but something darker, gliding just beneath. Beatrice froze, her hand flying to her throat. "Did you see that?" "Otter, probably." Eliza's tone was brisk, but she rowed harder once they were aboard, the oars cutting silent paths through the fog-shrouded current. The tincture was their hope, a brew of nightshade and willow bark, meant to numb the curse's bite long enough for a true night's sleep. But Harrow's warning echoed, it came at a cost, dulling more than pain, blurring the line between waking and the void. As the boat drifted toward the old mill on the far bank, Beatrice leaned over the side, trailing her fingers in the water. The cold bit deep, but it steadied her. She was the thinker, the one who pieced together remedies from faded journals, while Eliza charged ahead. Yet tonight, fear coiled in her gut like a serpent. The mill loomed ahead, its wheel creaking in the sluggish flow, a silhouette against the paling sky. They had chosen it for isolation, no prying eyes, no soft beds to tempt fate. Eliza beached the boat with a scrape, and they hauled the sack up the muddy incline. The mill door hung ajar on rusted hinges, groaning as Eliza pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint, acrid tang of moldering grain. Moonlight slanted through cracked windows, casting long shadows that danced like specters. Beatrice lit a single candle, its flame guttering in the draught, revealing the corner where they'd prepared their makeshift dens, 2 plain coffins, borrowed from Harrow's stock, their lids propped open like waiting graves. Eliza set the sack down and uncorked the first vial, the liquid inside swirling dark as ink. "1 drop each, on the tongue." "That's what he said." She tipped her head back, the droplet sliding down her throat with a bitter sting that made her wince. Beatrice followed, the taste blooming like ash on her tongue, spreading a numbness that crept into her limbs. They settled into their boxes, the pine cool against their backs, lids half closed to block the light. At first, relief washed over Beatrice, a soothing veil, muting the familiar itch beneath her skin. Sleep tugged at her edges, genuine and deep, for the first time in months. Eliza's breathing evened out nearby, a soft rhythm in the stillness. But as the candle burned low, Beatrice stirred. The numbness had deepened into something heavier, a weight pressing on her chest. She sat up, heart pounding against ribs that felt too tight. The shadows in the mill seemed to shift, elongating toward the door. A low scrape sounded from outside, like claws on wood, deliberate and unhurried. "Eliza," she whispered, shaking her sister's shoulder. Eliza's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, as if peering from underwater. "Something's out there." Eliza blinked, struggling to surface. The tincture's haze clung, slowing her thoughts. Another scrape, closer now, and then a whisper of breath against the doorframe. Not wind. Not animal. Beatrice's hand found Eliza's in the dark, their fingers interlocking as the first tendrils of dread uncoiled fully, wrapping around the mill like the fog outside. The door creaked inward, inch by inch, revealing not a man, but a silhouette too gaunt, too elongated, eyes gleaming with a hunger that mirrored their own curse. It wasn't father's men. It was something older, drawn by the scent of their blood-tainted rest, come to claim what the Coffins could no longer protect. Eliza's fingers trembled as she traced the splintered edge of the coffin lid, the wood rough under her nails like the bark of a dying tree. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten lavender, but beneath it lingered the metallic tang of blood, hers, from the night before, when the straw mattress had torn into her skin like invisible thorns. Clara huddled beside her, knees drawn up, her pale face half-shadowed by the single lantern's flicker. "We can't stay here," Clara whispered, her voice a threadbare plea. "The doctor's men are circling the town. They know about us now." Eliza nodded, but her mind raced ahead, piecing together scraps of a plan. They'd fled the family estate 3 weeks past, after the servants found the coffins hidden in the cellar and whispers turned to accusations of devilry. The ash from the great fire of 26 still choked the London air, or so the broadsheets claimed, but it was the sisters' curse that burned hottest. Any bed not lined with earth or sealed like a grave would weep blood from their pores until dawn. Coffins were their only sanctuary, scavenged from graveyards or bought from undertakers with stolen coin. But supplies dwindled, and the doctor's hunters, those grim-faced inquisitors with their silver tools and holy water, gained ground each night. "We head north," Eliza said, forcing steadiness into her tone. She was the brave one, always had been, the elder by 2 years who mended Clara's dresses and told stories to chase away the dark. "To the moors. There's an old chapel there, abandoned since the plague. We can hide the coffins in the crypt." Clara's eyes widened, doubt flickering like the lantern's flame. "And if they follow?" "You saw the posters, the Ashen sisters, vampires in girls' guise. They'll burn us before we reach it." The attic door creaked below, a slow groan that sent ice through Eliza's veins. Footsteps echoed up the narrow stairs, deliberate and unhurried. Clara clutched her sister's arm, nails digging in. Eliza pressed a finger to her lips, then pointed to the loose floorboard they'd pried earlier, revealing a crawlspace to the roof. "Go," she mouthed. But as Clara inched forward, the footsteps halted just outside the door. A key scraped in the lock, the innkeeper, no doubt, bribed or coerced. Eliza's heart hammered. She grabbed the lantern and swung it low, shattering it against the floorboards. Glass tinkled, oil bloomed into flame, and smoke curled upward in greedy tendrils. The fire caught the dry beams with a hungry crackle, buying them seconds. Clara scrambled into the space, her skirts snagging, and Eliza followed, the heat licking at her heels. They emerged onto the sloped roof, the night sky a vast, indifferent black above the rooftops of York. Wind whipped their hair as they slid down the tiles, boots scraping for purchase. Below, shouts rose from the street, the inn ablaze, shadows converging. "There!" The attic window, a voice barked, sharp as a whip. Eliza pulled Clara to the edge, where a rain barrel waited like a precarious stepping stone. They dropped, landing in a splash of foul water, then darted into the alley's embrace. Cobblestones slick underfoot, they ran, coffins abandoned in the attic's haste, a loss that twisted like a knife in Eliza's gut. Without them, dawn would come as torment. They wove through the labyrinth of backstreets, breath ragged, until the town's lanterns faded behind. The moors loomed ahead, a sea of heather and mist under the moon's pale gaze. Clara stumbled, her caution surfacing in a gasp. "We left everything. How will we sleep?" Eliza didn't answer, her witty retort silenced by the weight of failure. The plan had backfired spectacularly. The fire would draw every hunter within miles, painting their flight in strokes of infamy. By midnight, they reached the chapel's crumbling silhouette, its stone walls etched with ivy-like veins. The crypt door hung ajar, rusted hinges protesting as Eliza pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and stale, shelves of empty niches waiting like open mouths. No coffins here, but perhaps the stone slabs could serve, lined with their cloaks and the earth's own chill. Clara sank against a wall, exhaustion carving hollows under her eyes. "We're trapped now," she murmured. "They'll come at first light." Eliza scanned the shadows, spotting a faint gleam, an old sarcophagus, its lid cracked but intact. "Not trapped," she said, though her voice wavered. "Adapting." She helped Clara inside, the stone unyielding but bloodless against their skin. As they settled, the distant howl of dogs pierced the night, closing in. Sleep came fitfully, the earth's whisper a fragile shield, while outside, the moor wind carried the scent of smoke and pursuit. Ilara's fingers trembled as she traced the splintered edge of the coffin lid, the wood rough against her skin like the bark of an ancient yew. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten secrets, motes dancing in the sliver of moonlight that pierced the boarded window. Below, the house creaked under the weight of the storm, rain lashing the roof like accusations. She glanced at Mira, her sister's face pale and drawn, eyes shadowed with the same exhaustion that clawed at Ilara's own bones. "We can't keep doing this," Mira whispered, her voice barely cutting through the wind's howl. She shifted in her makeshift bed, a pine box scavenged from the undertaker's yard, lined with musty straw. The coffins were their only refuge now, ever since the bleeding started 3 moons past. Ordinary beds, with their feather mattresses and linen sheets, turned their nights into rivers of crimson, soaking through to the floorboards. The doctor in the village had called it a delicate constitution, prescribed tonics that tasted of iron and lies. But Ilara knew better. It was the curse of the Ashen sisters, whispered in family lore, a blight that bound them to the earth like roots to soil. Ilara knelt beside her, pressing a damp cloth to Myra's forehead. The fever had come on sudden that evening, after they'd buried the last of their linen stained with blood. "Hush now. The storm will pass, and so will this." But her words felt hollow, even to her. Downstairs, their Aunt Beatrice paced the parlor, her footsteps a rhythmic thunder. Aunt Beatrice, with her sharp tongue and sharper suspicions, had taken them in after their parents' fever claimed them. She tolerated the coffins at first, chalking it up to childish whims. Now, with the village murmuring of witchcraft, her patience frayed like old rope. A knock echoed from the front door, sharp and insistent, cutting through the gale. Ilara froze, her heart stuttering. Myra's eyes snapped open, wide with fear. "Who could it be at this hour?" she breathed, clutching the edge of her coffin. "Stay here," Ilara said, rising slowly. She grabbed the lantern from the hook, its flame flickering like a trapped soul. Descending the narrow stairs, each step groaned under her weight, the house alive with complaint. Aunt Beatrice's voice carried from the entry, low and edged with caution. "What business have you here, Reverend?" The door creaked open wider, spilling cold air and the scent of wet wool. Reverend Harrow stood there, his black coat dripping, face gaunt under the brim of his hat. His eyes, sharp as flint, scanned the dim hall. "Beatrice, I've come for the girls. The elders have decided, their affliction spreads rumor like plague. They must be examined." Ilara pressed against the wall, hidden in the shadows of the landing. "Examined." The word slithered through her, cold as grave dirt. The village had always eyed them askance, the Ashen sisters, pale as birch bark, with hair like spun ash. But since the bleedings, whispers turned to accusations, vampires, witches, demons in girls' guise. Last week, old Widow Green had spat at them in the market, crossing herself. Aunt Beatrice's laugh was brittle. "Examined by whom?" "Your prayer circles. They've done nothing but stoke the fear." Harrow stepped inside, uninvited, his boots leaving muddy prints. "The scriptures demand purity. If they sleep in coffins, what unholy pact do they keep?" "The bleeding, it's a sign, Beatrice. A mark of sin." Ilara's blood ran hot, then cold. She slipped back up the stairs, pulse thundering in her ears. Mira was sitting up now, her nightgown spotted with fresh red. "What did you hear?" she asked, voice urgent. The Reverend. He wants us. Ilara's mind raced, piecing fragments of the old tales their mother told. The curse began with Great-Aunt Lydia, who bedded down in a coffin after her lover's death, only to wake with skin that wept blood on anything soft. It passed to daughters, binding them to wood and earth. To break it meant facing the source, the shadowed glade beyond the village, where Lydia's grave lay unmarked. We run, Mira said, swinging her legs over the coffin's edge. But as her feet touched the floorboards, a gasp escaped her, a thin line of blood welled along her soul, seeping into the cracks. She winced, pulling back. Or, we end it. Tonight. Ilara nodded, the decision settling like lead. The storm raged on, a veil for their escape. She helped Mira into a cloak, then dragged their small satchel, stuffed with bread, a flask of water, and the iron knife their father had forged. The coffins would stay, too heavy to carry, and the attic their alibi if Aunt Beatrice woke fully. They crept down, avoiding the creaking third step. The parlor door stood ajar, voices rising. Take them at dawn, Beatrice. For their souls' sake. Harrow's tone brooked no argument. Ilara signaled Mira, and they darted for the back door, into the scullery where rain drummed on the panes. The latch stuck, slick with damp, and for a heart-stopping moment, Ilara thought it locked. Then it gave, spilling them into the yard. Mud sucked at their shoes as they fled toward the tree lean, the village lights blurring in the downpour. Behind them, the house door slammed open. Ilara. Mira. Aunt Beatrice's cry pierced the night, laced with something like relief, or was it betrayal? Footsteps splashed, Harrow's voice joining the chase. The forest swallowed them whole, branches whipping like accusatory fingers. Mira stumbled, her breath ragged, blood trailing from a gash on her hand where thorns had caught. Ilara pulled her onward, the glade their beacon. Legend said Lydia's spirit guarded the cure, a root from her grave, bitter as regret, that could unbind the blood. But as they pushed deeper, the trees thickened, their trunks the lantern's flame guttered low in the damp crypt, casting jagged shadows that danced like fingers across the stone walls. Eliza pressed her back against the cold slab, her breath shallow, as if the air itself might betray them. The eldest sister, always the anchor, scanned the iron-barred door with eyes sharpened by years of vigilance. Her hands, calloused from hauling crates in the dead of night, clenched around a makeshift pry bar, a rusted candelabrum arm scavenged from the churchyard above. "They're closer," whispered Clara, the middle one, her voice a threadbare plea. Cautious to a fault, she huddled near the coffins they dragged in for shelter, her fingers tracing the splintered wood as if it could ward off the inevitable. The bleeding had started again that dawn, faint rivulets from the scratches on her arms where the rough blanket had chafed. Beds were poison to them, always had been since the fever took their parents and left the sisters marked, skin that wept crimson at the touch of anything soft, anything alive with warmth. Coffins were their only mercy, unyielding and dead as bone. Lila, the youngest, paced the narrow space with a forced grin, her wit a shield against the creeping chill. "Closer. Darling, they're practically knocking. If we don't move, we'll be the evening's entertainment for old Manford and his pitchfork brigade." She kicked at a loose pebble, sending it skittering into the gloom, but her eyes betrayed the joke, wide and flickering toward the faint scratches echoing from above. The townsfolk had caught wind of their secret, whispers turning to shouts after the miller's boy glimpsed them slipping into the graveyard at dusk. Now the hunt was on, fueled by superstition and the promise of a bounty from the parson. Eliza shot her a look, sharp as the wind slicing through the crypt's cracks. "Hush. We stick to the plan, wait till moonrise, then slip out the back tunnel to the river. The current will cover our tracks." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The tunnel, a forgotten vein in the earth, had seemed a godsend when they found it 2 nights past. Now, with the mob's lanterns bobbing like fireflies on the hill, it felt like a noose tightening. Clara shook her head, her dark curls matted with sweat. "What if they blocked it? I heard them chopping wood earlier," torches, maybe barricades. She glanced at the coffins, their lids ajar like waiting mouths. Inside, the sisters had always found a fragile peace, the unlined pine cradling their bodies without the betrayal of sheets or feathers. But peace was a luxury they couldn't afford tonight. The bleeding worsened in stress, turning scratches to gashes, and the crypt's chill only hastened the pallor that made them look like ghosts already. A thud reverberated from the door, followed by the scrape of metal on stone. Lila froze mid-step, her playful facade cracking. Eliza. The word hung, unfinished, as muffled voices filtered through, angry, insistent. Witches. Coffin sleepers. Come out, or we'll smoke you. Eliza's grip tightened on the pry bar. The plan was unraveling before it could breathe. They'd meant to lure the mob away with a decoy fire in the old barn, but Lila's slip, dropping that bloodied rag on the path, had drawn them straight here. We go now, Eliza decided, voice low and resolute. She wedged the bar into the door's hinge, muscles straining against the rust. Sparks flew, faint in the lantern light, illuminating the grim set of her jaw. Clara scrambled to her feet, helping Lila drag one coffin toward the rear wall where the tunnel mouth yawned black. But as they shoved it aside, a low groan echoed, not from the wood, but from the earth itself. Dust sifted down, and a fetid draft carried the tang of rot. The tunnels flooded, Clara gasped, peering into the void. Water lapped at the threshold, murky and rising, swollen from the recent rains. Their escape, drowned. Lila's laugh was brittle, edged with hysteria. Well, that's one way to wash away our sins. Swim for it. But the water's surface rippled unnaturally, bubbles bursting with a sour hiss, as if something stirred beneath. Above, the door buckled under a ram's blow, hinges screaming. Eliza abandoned the bar and turned, her brave heart pounding a war drum. Into the water. Hold your breath and push. She didn't wait for agreement, plunging her hand into the chill flow first, ignoring the sting where it met her open cuts. The sisters linked arms, coffins forgotten, and waded in as one. The mob's roar swelled behind them, but the tunnel swallowed their cries, replacing them with the slosh of unseen depths and the slow, inexorable pull of the current. As they submerged, Eliza felt the first true dread coil in her gut, not the townsfolk's fire, but the shadow that brushed her leg in the dark water, cold and questing. The river wasn't empty tonight. Something older waited, drawn by the scent of their blood. Ilara's fingers trembled as she traced the splintered edge of the coffin lid, the wood rough under her nails like the bark of a dying oak. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten lavender, a scent that clung to the sisters' dresses like a shroud. Below, the house groaned under the weight of the storm, rain lashing the roof in relentless sheets. It had been 3 nights since Myra's screams had torn through the silence, her body twisting in the featherbed as if the mattress itself clawed at her veins. Now, with the coffins dragged up from the cellar, cold, unyielding pine boxes that offered no comfort but at least no blood, they huddled together, the air thick with unspoken fears. Why here? Leora whispered, her voice a threadbare plea as she pressed against Ilara's side. The youngest at 16, she was the cautious one, her wide eyes always scanning shadows for threats that might not exist. But tonight, they did. The coffins were lined up like sentinels along the attic's slanted wall, their lids propped open just enough to peer out into the dimness. Ilara, brave to the point of recklessness, had insisted on this perch, high above the bleeding beds, away from whatever curse haunted the lower floors. Because the storm hides us, Ilara replied, her tone steady despite the chill seeping through her thin shawl. At 19, she carried the weight of their small world on her shoulders, her dark hair pinned back with a resolve that masked her own dread. She glanced at the third sister, absent in body but not in memory, Aunt Thessaly, who had whispered tales of the Ashen blood before vanishing into the night 2 winters past. And Mira needs rest. If we stay low, it finds us. Mira stirred in her coffin, a low moan escaping her lips. Her face, pale as moonlight on frost, glistened with sweat. The bleeding had stopped once they pried her from the bed, but the wounds, thin, deliberate slits along her arms and neck, pulsed with an unnatural heat. "It's in the feathers," she murmured, eyes fluttering open to reveal pupils dilated like black wells. "The down, it's alive. Pecking at us from inside the pillows." Her wit, usually sharp as a needle, had dulled to fragments, but even now, she tried to laugh it off, the sound breaking into a cough. The attic window rattled, wind howling as if mocking their fragile sanctuary. Elara leaned over the edge of her coffin, peering down the ladder to the floor below. The house, inherited from their parents' untimely end in a mill fire, had always felt watchful, its walls etched with faint, swirling patterns that resembled veins. But since the first bleed, Leora's, on a night when the moon hung low and bloated, the pattern seemed to shift, coiling tighter with each drop of blood spilled on linen. They had burned the mattresses in the yard, watched the flames devour the stuffing until only ash remained, but the curse lingered, drawn to softness, to rest. A floorboard creaked downstairs, deliberate and slow, like footsteps testing the dark. Leora's hand clamped on Elara's arm, nails digging in. "Did you hear that? It's not the storm." Her breath came quick, cautious instincts flaring into panic. Elara shook her head, but her heart pounded a warning rhythm. They had boarded the bedroom doors, scattered salt along the thresholds, old remedies from Thessaly's journals, but the house was vast, its corners hiding more than mice. "Stay quiet," Elara hissed, pulling the lid down an inch, the wood scraping like bones on stone. Inside the confined space, the air grew stale, pressing against their skin. Myra's coffin was closest to the ladder, and Elara could hear her sister's ragged breathing, each inhale a battle. The challenge had escalated that afternoon. While scavenging the root cellar for anything unyielding to sleep on, Leora had found a hidden panel, revealing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Thessaly's handwriting, frantic loops confessing that the beds weren't the source, the blood was a summons, calling something ancient from the soil beneath the foundation. "The Ashen ones sleep deep," one note read, "and they hunger for what we shed in comfort." Thunder cracked overhead, vibrating the beams, and in that split second, the creak returned, closer now, ascending the ladder with a weight that bent the rungs. Elara's mind raced, her bravery curdling into calculation. They couldn't run, the storm flooded the paths to town, and the villagers already whispered of the bleeding girls as if they carried plague. No, they had to face it here, in this area of coffins, where the wood offered a barrier, thin as it was. Leora whimpered, curling tighter into her box. "Elara, what if it's her? What if Aunt Thessaly came back, changed?" The idea hung between them, dread uncoiling like smoke. Mira, ever the witty core, managed a weak retort from her shadows, "Then we'll ask her why she left us with this nightmare." Politely. The ladder groaned once more, and a shadow stretched across the attic floor, long, elongated, as if cast by no ordinary light. Elara gripped a loose nail from the floorboards, her palm slick. The plan from earlier, luring whatever it was into the open and sealing it with the attic hatch, felt foolish now, backfired by the storm's fury trapping them all. Tension coiled in her chest, earnest and unyielding. They were sisters bound by blood, and blood was the key, whether to unlock horror or survival. As the shadow pooled at the ladder's top, a voice slithered up, soft, almost maternal, echoing Thessaly's cadence. "Girls, why do you hide in boxes? Come down to your beds. Let me tuck you in." The words dripped like rain through cracks, promising ease but laced with the metallic tang of old blood. Elara's resolve hardened, they would not yield. Not yet. The coffins, crude as they were, bought them time to whisper anew. The fog clung to the gravestones like a shroud, muting the distant toll of the church bell as Eliza pressed her back against the cold iron gate of the family crypt. Her fingers, still slick with the residue of grave soil, gripped the latch tighter. Beside her, Clara whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice a fragile thread in the thickening night. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, iron, perhaps, or the metallic tang of their own fear. They had come here after fleeing the manor, the sisters' coffins slung over their shoulders like burdens from a forgotten life, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer now, as if the ground itself hungered for them. Eliza's heart pounded in rhythm with the bell's fading echo. She had always been the bold one, the sister who laughed at superstitions while bandaging Clara's scraped knees from their childhood romps through the moors. But tonight, boldness felt like a fraying rope. The bleeding had started again that afternoon, not from the feather bed they had tried in desperation at the inn, but from shallow cuts that appeared on their palms as they unpacked the coffins. "It's worsening," Clara had said, her eyes wide and unblinking, dabbing at the wounds with a handkerchief already stained crimson. Now, in the crypt's dim entrance, Eliza wondered if the coffins were no longer sanctuary but cage. A rustle from the underbrush snapped her attention. She froze, her breath catching as a figure emerged from the mist, not the vicar they had hoped to find for sanctuary, but a silhouette too gaunt, too deliberate in its gait. It was Mr. Harrow, the groundskeeper from the manor, his lantern swinging low like a pendulum. His face, etched with lines from years of tending the dead, twisted into a grimace that might have been concern or something darker. "Miss Eliza. Miss Clara. What devilry brings you to desecrate these grounds at such an hour?" Clara stepped forward, her cautious nature urging restraint, but her voice trembled with urgency. "We need shelter, Mr. Harrow. The village, they think us witches now, after what happened at the inn." She didn't elaborate. The screams of the innkeeper's wife when she saw the coffins, the accusations of grave robbing that had chased them into the night. Eliza shot her sister a glance, willing her to hold back the truth about the bleeding, the way their skin split open on anything softer than pine and iron. Harrow's eyes narrowed, flicking to the bundles at their feet. He set the lantern down, its light casting elongated shadows that danced like specters across the crypt door. "Witches, eh? Or worse. I've heard the tales, Ashen sisters, they call you in the taverns. Girls who sleep with the dead because the living world rejects you." He reached for the latch, his hand brushing Eliza's, and she flinched as if burned. A thin line of red welled up where their skin met, unnoticed by him but searing to her. Inside the crypt, the air grew stale, heavy with the scent of moldering stone and forgotten incense. They wedged the coffins against the far wall, the wood scraping against lichen-covered slabs. Clara knelt to arrange the linens they had salvaged, coarse wool that wouldn't tear their flesh, while Eliza barred the door with a rusted chain. "We'll wait till dawn," Eliza murmured, her wit dulled by exhaustion. "The vicar comes at first light. He'll vouch for us." But doubt gnawed at her. The vicar had been the one to seal their parents' tomb years ago, muttering prayers over the affliction that had claimed them both in their sleep, bodies unmarked save for the blood-soaked sheets. As they settled into the coffins, the lids creaking shut like reluctant confessions, a low scratching echoed from the walls. Clara's eyes met Eliza's through the gloom, her face pale as moonlight. "It's just rats," she said, but her fingers clutched the edge of the coffin, knuckles whitening. The sound grew insistent, not erratic like vermin, but methodical, a clawing, as if something tested the mortar from below. Eliza sat up, her pulse quickening, and pressed her ear to the stone. The vibration hummed through her bones, carrying faint whispers that sounded like names: Eliza. Clara. Harrow had vanished into the fog upon leaving them, his lantern's glow swallowed whole, but now footsteps crunched outside, multiple sets, heavy and purposeful. Voices murmured, low and accusatory, filtering through the cracks. The groundskeeper saw them. Coffins in the crypt, unnatural. Eliza's mind raced. They had trusted too quickly, or perhaps Harrow's loyalty lay with the villagers' fear. She rattled the chain, but it held firm, the links groaning under her pull. Clara whimpered, curling tighter in her makeshift bed. What if it's not just the bleeding? What if the coffins call something? Her words hung in the air, earnest in their terror, as the scratching intensified, now joined by a rhythmic thumping from the earth beneath them. Eliza forced a steady breath, her bravery a shield cracked but unyielding. She slid her hand through the coffin's slats, grasping Clara's. "Then we face it together. Like always." The door shuddered under the first blow, wood splintering like bone. Shadows lengthened inside, coiling around the coffins as if alive. Eliza whispered a plan: wait for the breach, then bolt for the back tunnel she remembered from childhood games, but the ground trembled, and a fissure snaked across the floor, exhaling a chill that tasted of decay. From it rose a hand, pale and claw-like, reaching not for the door, but for the coffins themselves. The sisters' screams merged with the villagers' shouts outside, the night fracturing into chaos as the crypt's secrets clawed their way free. The fog clung to the cobblestones like a shroud as Eliza led the way through the narrow alley behind the apothecary. Her boots splashed in shallow puddles, each step echoing too loudly in the pre-dawn hush. Clara trailed close, her breath coming in shallow gasps, one hand clutching the worn leather satchel that held their only remaining vial of the elderroot serum. The air smelled of damp stone and distant smoke, but beneath it lurked something sharper, rot, like unearthed soil after a grave robbing. They had come to this forsaken corner of London seeking refuge, but the night had twisted into pursuit. Mr. Harrow, the gaunt undertaker with eyes like polished obsidian, had followed them from the cemetery outskirts. He wasn't alone, his apprentices, silent shadows in threadbare coats, fanned out behind him, their lanterns casting erratic flickers that danced like will-o'-the-wisps. Eliza glanced back, her heart pounding. "Keep moving," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. Brave as she was, the weight of their secret pressed heavier now, the coffins they dragged from place to place, not for burial, but for sleep, because feather beds tore at their skin like thorns, drawing blood that wouldn't clot. Clara stumbled over a loose brick, catching herself on Eliza's arm. "He's gaining," she murmured, her cautious nature flaring into panic. The serum was nearly gone. Without it, the bleeding would start again, slow at first, then relentless, turning their nights into rivers of crimson. They had fled their last hiding spot in the crypt beneath St. Mary's when Harrow's men had pried open the iron gate, their tools scraping like claws on bone. What did he want? The coffins, lined with the rare ash wood that soothed their affliction? Or the truth of the Ashen sisters, whispered in taverns as cursed girls who slept among the dead? Eliza pulled Clara into a recessed doorway, the splintered wood biting into her palm. The alley forked ahead, left toward the Thames, where the river's murk might swallow their trail, or right into the warren of tenements, crowded with early risers who might betray them for a shilling. Harrow's voice slithered through the mist, low and measured. "Ladies, no need for this chase. The society values your uniqueness. Come willingly, and the coffins stay yours." Uniqueness. The word curdled in Eliza's gut. The Royal Society for Arcane Studies, Harrow's masters, collected anomalies like specimens, girls who bled from ordinary rest, whose only peace came in boxes meant for the grave. She had overheard enough in the shadows to know their cures ended in dissection. "We can't trust him," Eliza said, her eyes locking on Clara's. The younger sister nodded, her wit surfacing in a bitter half-smile. "Trust an undertaker? I'd sooner bed down on nettles." They darted right into the labyrinth of sagging buildings. The tenements loomed, windows shuttered against the chill, but voices murmured within, factory workers stirring for the shift. A dog barked sharply, setting Eliza's nerves alight. Behind them, boots thudded closer, lanterns bobbing like predatory eyes. Clara's face paled, a thin line of blood already trickling from a scratch on her hand where she'd gripped the satchel too tightly. The serum's effects waned with the hour. Eliza spotted a ladder bolted to the side of a warehouse, rusted but sturdy. "Up," she hissed, boosting Clara first. The metal groaned under their weight, flakes of rust dusting their skirts like faded ash. From the rooftop, the city sprawled in grayscale, the river a silver vein pulsing in the distance. Harrow's group emerged into the alley below, their lights sweeping like scythes. One apprentice pointed upward, and Eliza's stomach dropped. They scrambled across the tarred roof, the pitch sticky underfoot, dodging chimney stacks that belched faint smoke. Clara slipped, her knee hitting the edge hard enough to bruise, but she bit back a cry. "The serum, it's all we have left." Eliza nodded, rummaging in the satchel for the vial. Her hands shook as she uncorked it, the earthy scent rising like a promise. She pressed it to Clara's lips first, then her own, the bitter liquid burning down her throat. It bought time, staunching the invisible wounds that normal slumber inflicted, but Harrow's pursuit was no metaphor. He climbed the ladder now, his coat flapping like raven wings. A skylight loomed ahead, grimy glass cracked in one corner. Eliza smashed it with her elbow, shards tinkling into the void below. They dropped into the warehouse's dim interior, landing amid crates of forgotten linens, ironic, given their curse. Dust motes swirled in the intrusion of fog, and the air hung heavy with mildew. Footsteps echoed from the roof. Harrow was descending. Huddled behind a stack of bolts of cloth, Eliza whispered a plan born of desperation. "The river. We swim if we must. Better drowned than pinned like butterflies." Clara's eyes widened, but she gripped Eliza's hand. "Together, then. Sisters to the end." The warehouse door rattled, Harrow's men, circling. Eliza's mind raced, the bleeding's faintage already teasing at her skin, a reminder of the cost. They couldn't run forever, but surrender was death in disguise. As the first crate toppled with a crash, revealing their hiding spot, Eliza surged forward, grabbing a loose plank from the floor. It wasn't much, but it was something, wood against the encroaching dark. Elara's fingers trembled as she pried open the rusted latch on the crypt door, the iron biting into her palm like a reluctant confession. The air inside hung thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten incense, a veil that muffled the distant toll of the village clock striking midnight. Beside her, Mira clutched the lantern, its flame flickering against the shadows that seemed to lean in, hungry for the light. Their breaths came in shallow unison, the only sound in the suffocating quiet, save for the faint drip of water from some unseen fissure overhead. They had come this far on whispers and half-remembered maps, chasing the legend of the herbalist who had once bound the sister's curse with roots and incantations. But now, as the door groaned inward, Elara felt the familiar itch beneath her skin, a warning that the night was turning against them. "It's too still," Mira murmured, her voice a threadbare whisper. She was the cautious one, always counting the costs before they spilled over, but tonight her eyes darted like trapped birds. The crypt's interior unfolded in jagged silhouettes, stone slabs etched with faded names, cobwebs draping like funeral shrouds. Elara stepped forward first, her boots scraping against the grit, leading them toward the alcove where the herbalist's relics were said to lie. The lantern cast elongated shadows that twisted into grasping hands, and Myra's free hand hovered near her sister's back, a silent tether. They had buried their parents here years ago, before the bleeding began, before the beds turned traitor and the coffins became their only sanctuary. Now, the dead watched them pilfer secrets from their midst. A sudden skittering echoed from the far wall, like bones rattling in a forgotten pocket. Elara froze, her heart a dull thud against her ribs. "Rats," she said, but the word tasted like a lie. Mira swung the lantern higher, illuminating a recess where a wooden chest squatted, its lid warped and splintered. They knelt together, Elara's brave hand steadying as she lifted the latch. Inside, amid brittle scrolls and vials of dried herbs, lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Myra's breath hitched as Elara opened it, the spine cracking like a breaking vow. The herbalist's script sprawled across the first page, *, "The Ashen curse binds the blood to the living wood of beds, a retribution for the sister's forgotten sin. To sever it, one must offer what was taken, sleep eternal in the earth's embrace, *. Elara's eyes scanned faster, the words blurring into urgency. Diagrams followed, sketches of roots intertwined with veins, and a ritual involving moonlight and a blade drawn from the family's own grave. But as they pored over the text, the skittering returned, closer now, a chorus of tiny claws on stone. Mira slammed the journal shut, stuffing it into her satchel. "We can't stay. The air, it's thickening." Elara nodded, rising, but her gaze caught on a glint in the corner, a small, ornate dagger, its hilt carved with thorns that mirrored the one scarring their dreams. She snatched it up, the metal cool and unervingly light, as if it had been waiting. They turned to leave, but the crypt door, which had swung open so easily, now resisted their push. Elara shoved harder, her shoulder bruising against the unyielding iron. It stuck, she grunted, panic edging her voice. Mira pounded on the panels, the echoes mocking their efforts. From behind, the skittering swelled into a rustle, and in the lantern's sway, Elara glimpsed them, not rats, but pale, writhing shapes slithering from the cracks, centuries-old guardians of the dead, drawn by the disturbance. Myra's face paled, her cautious nature fracturing into raw fear. The curse knows we're here. It's calling them. Elara gripped the dagger tighter, her bravery a fragile shield. She wedged the blade into the door's seam, leveraging with all her weight. Wood splintered, and the door gave way with a shriek, spilling them into the moonlit graveyard. They stumbled out, gasping, the shapes hissing in pursuit but halting at the threshold, bound by some invisible line. As they fled through the tombstones, the journal thumped against Myra's side like a second heartbeat. The village lights flickered in the distance, a false promise of safety. Elara glanced back once, the crypt mouth yawning black and empty, but she felt the pull, the curse tightening its noose, demanding the ritual they now held in their hands. Dawn was hours away, and with it, the risk of beds that would drink them dry. But the dagger in her fist whispered of blood yet to be spilled, a price they might not all survive. Elara's fingers trembled as she traced the faded inscription on the coffin lid, the wood cool and unyielding beneath her touch. The attic air hung thick with dust motes that danced in a sliver of moonlight piercing the cracked window, and below, the house groaned like a beast settling into uneasy sleep. Her sisters, Leora, pale and watchful, and Mira, whose breaths came in shallow rasps, huddled close, their nightgowns stained with the faint, rusty smears that never quite washed out. It had been 3 nights since the bleeding started anew, worse than before, seeping from their pores whenever they dared lie on anything softer than pine and earth. The coffins, salvaged from the old cemetery on the hill, were their only sanctuary now, narrow prisons that cradled them without betrayal. But tonight, the shadows in the attic twisted differently, coiling around the rafters like fingers reaching down. Elara had seen it first, an outline in the corner, humanoid but elongated, its edges blurring into the gloom. "It's here," she whispered, her voice a threadbare thing, barely cutting the silence. Leora nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the fear they all shared, while Mira clutched the silver locket at her throat, the one their mother had left them before the fever took her. The entity had followed them from the village, drawn by the blood that marked them as Ashen sisters, cursed daughters of a lineage whispered about in taverns. It fed on their weakness, growing bolder each time they weakened from the endless nights of vigilance. They had tried everything, the salt lines Elara drew with shaking hands, the chants Leora murmured from the forbidden books smuggled from the vicar's library. Myra's clever traps, wires strung with bells and broken glass, had rung out twice, but the thing slipped through, leaving only a chill that lingered in their bones. Now, as the clock downstairs struck 2, the air grew heavier, pressing against their chests. Elara's plan, born of desperation in the pre-dawn hours, felt like madness. They would invite it in, not fight, but bind it with their own blood, the very thing that damned them. "Remember," Elara said, pricking her thumb on the coffin nail until a bead of crimson welled up. She smeared it along the lid's edge, a deliberate line that burned her skin. "We offer what it craves, but on our terms." Leora followed suit, her face set in grim determination, the brave one who had always led them through the moor's mists. Mira hesitated, her witty retort silenced by exhaustion, but she nodded, slicing her palm shallowly. The blood dripped onto the floorboards, dark petals blooming in the wood. The shadow stirred, detaching from the wall with a sigh like wine through cracked stone. It slithered forward, formless yet hungry, the air turning acrid with the scent of wet earth and decay. Elara's heart pounded as it neared, the coffins creaking open behind them like invitations to the grave. They stepped back in unison, pressing against the rough-hewn sides, their bare feet leaving bloody prints. The entity paused, tasting the air, then lunged, not with claws, but a slow envelopment, tendrils of darkness wrapping around their ankles, cold as coffin silk. Pain flared, sharp and familiar, as if the beds of their childhood had returned to claim them. Elara bit back a cry, focusing on the binding words Leora intoned, her voice steady despite the tremor. By blood we woke you, by blood we chain. The shadow writhed, pulling tighter, and Mira gasped, her hand finding Elara's in the dark. Together, they pressed their wounds to the coffin's edge, letting the flow mingle with the salt and symbols etched there. The entity recoiled, a low keen echoing through the attic, but it didn't flee. Instead, it condensed, drawn into the heart of their offering, the blood pooling and darkening until it hardened like tar. Minutes stretched into eternity, the sisters' breath sinking in ragged harmony. The cold seeped deeper, numbing their limbs, but they held fast, whispering encouragements. Leora's quiet, "We've got this," Myra's faint, "Not tonight, you bastard." At last, the shadow shuddered, collapsing inward with a sound like splintering bone, absorbed into the coffin's waiting maws. The air lightened, the dread lifting like fog at dawn, leaving only the faint echo of its hunger. Dawn crept in, gray and unforgiving, as they sealed the lids with trembling hands. The bleeding had stopped, for now, the wounds cauterized by the ritual's fire. But as Elara glanced at her sisters, their faces drawn and ashen, she knew the cost. The entity was bound, not banished, tethered to the coffins they could never abandon. They would carry it with them, sisters in curse and coffin, through whatever nights remained. The house below stirred with the village's awakening, oblivious, while up here, the wood creaked softly, a promise, or a warning.